To this presentation of Unit 2, the development of an industrial United States. We're going to be looking at how the West and populism started to grow and continue to increase the industrial growth of the United States. So let's begin with looking at the West. First of all, try to take a couple minutes, and I'll pause it, but look at the ideas of these words and try to write a sentence using three of them. So the ideas of these terms are to show you how Western growth led to a rise of urbanization. This is when we start to see the growth of cities like Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, all these Midwestern industrial towns growing as more and more products are coming out of the West. So, as the West was settled, there were a lot of pretty horrifying acts that occurred. One of those was like the Sand Creek Massacre, where the Cheyenne people were massacred by the U.S. cavalry. General Custer and Sitting Bull, where Custer's last stand led to a native victory, and then also the process of assimilation that came through the Dawes Act, and plans for moving away from the massacre and killing of Native Americans to the assimilation of them into American culture. All of this is going to change the West and make it an American West. This American West was going to need to be peopled. And so in order to do that, they passed laws like the Homestead Act, starting to settle the plains by giving land to new people migrating to these western plains. Now, homesteading and farming were not a very easy thing to do. You're coming out into the middle of the land that is empty and was usually used by the native people for some farming, but mostly hunting and gathering. So a new process is going to have to take place, a new type of labor. And when that new labor grows, it changes the way that transportation and land are looked at. And this is going to lead to the rise of populism. Populism was a very interesting political change in America because it started to realize that these things that were using government money, like railroad and different types of agriculture building, were going to jack up prices. And what happened is that the working class people were not benefiting from it. So this would lead to better working conditions, people fighting for better working conditions and better pay, and what essentially will cause the rise of populism. And what it did is it changed the way that people viewed their political parties. At this point now, the middle class and the working class start to look at how the Democratic Party would give them a political voice. And that's going to be significant as the idea of the industrial North grows. So in the meantime, while all of these Western territories are being grown into kind of agricultural, rural areas, the cities that are taking the products from them, and exemplified by guys like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, are starting to get a large amount of wealth. A big reason for this was because of the Transcontinental Railroad. But on the other side of this, while there's this growth, the growth is coming from people who are growing and working in these industries. And Chicago actually becomes one of the central areas for what will be labor reform, kind of at the same level as that populism, where political changes are happening because more and more of the working class are gaining power and wealth. A good example of this was the Haymarket Affair, where bombs and violence essentially stoked the conflict that was going between the rich owners of the industry and that working class. So now we need to look at industrialization and urbanization, which becomes as kind of the same time as we're heading westward and getting all of these new products, cities are growing. Well, let's begin with a little focus at some of the names and ideas of immigration, urbanization, and industrialization. Try to take three of these terms and put them into one sentence. See if you can come up with a conglomeration of a sentence that makes sense. So immigration and urbanization really is exemplified by these two areas of central immigration. One was Ellis Island, where in New York City, most European immigrants passed through to come to the United States, and then Angel Island, where mostly Asian and particularly Chinese immigrants came to the US in San Francisco. These are the two locations where most migrants to America in the early 20th century and late 19th century are going to give the growth of our Midwestern part of the US? Well, there's going to be a choice that's going to have to be made, and most of these immigrants came to big cities. And so, what started to happen is that as the cities grew, places like Chicago and New York, men started to, figure out that they needed to plan them. Guys like Frederick Law Olmsted and Daniel Burnham came up with plans. And if you ever go into a major city, you will notice that they do have a very significant plan to them, and they are built on grid systems. In this picture, you can see Chicago, which is basically a big giant square with different streets that go parallel and perpendicular. Growing cities lead to a change. Consumerism, mass culture, and the expansion of education is going to lead to what we call reform. This urbanization leads to changes in a lot of things, not just the idea of race changes that we're getting back into, but for example, Plessy versus Ferguson, a court case that basically saw that segregation was legal, was one example of how this reform didn't necessarily cause a great deal of change. But what it did do is it said that it was legal for African Americans to have separate facilities. This is going to be very counteractive to some of the progressivism, however, that occurs when we get the growth of the suffrage movement and progressives under Teddy Roosevelt who are fighting for improved treatment of workers, more conservation, health and safety, and obviously the idea for women's right to vote. And that's going to be something that is going to be counterproductive to the race question, because while we're moving towards segregation in the early 20th century, we are starting to see some changes for the more impoverished people of the US and getting some more of their rights. All right, so culture and reform are a result of a growing consumer and a growing middle class. The rise of consumerism, which could be exemplified by the industry of Rockefeller and Carnegie, eventually is questioned as many yellow journalists and muckrakers start to say, hey, look at how these wealthy are destroying the working class. And that is the rise of the media, which will help us get a better understanding of where this reform movement comes from. So, as westward expansion was coming to a close, the turn of the 20th century ushered in a period of industrial growth, increased immigration, and a period of reform. And that is what we will be focusing on, and that we will culminate with an extensive research project in the next couple weeks.